locate, manage, critically evaluate, and synthesize information, and is able to use information ethically for academic assignments, problem solving, decision making, continued professional development, and lifelong learning. That's a lot to fit into a 50-minute workshop, I can tell you. So, but in other words, and this is something that I've actually been thinking a lot about lately based on some other work that I've been doing on looking for relationships between information literacy and scholarly communication. This is a definition that I think broadens the idea of information literacy and also connects it more closely with scholarly research methods. So in my definition, information literate individuals understand that scholars in the disciplines create, share, and preserve knowledge and have a basic understanding of how these processes occur. So that's just something for us to think about. The other thing I've been thinking about is information literacy as a threshold concept. This is based on the work of two people, you may be familiar with it, named, I want to get their names right, Jan Meyer and Ray Lund. And in their definition of threshold concepts, they are core ideas and processes that define ways of thinking and practicing for a discipline. And the thing that I think is really interesting about this definition is the second part. They are often so ingrained that they go unspoken or unrecognized by practitioners. So characteristics of threshold concepts are that they are transformative. They cause the learner to experience a shift in perspective. They are integrative. They bring together separate concepts, often identified as learning objectives or competencies, into a unified whole. They are irreversible. Once grasped, they cannot be ungrasped. They can't be unlearned. They're troublesome. They're often counterintuitive, the place where students stumble or get stuck. And they are bounded. They may help define the boundaries of a particular discipline and are perhaps unique to that discipline. So if you think about your own area of where you have your expertise, you probably could identify the characteristics, the concepts, the skills and knowledge that one needs to have that meet these characteristics, that illustrate this. So something that I have been thinking about a lot and really have been trying to promote a professional conversation around is that information literacy is a threshold concept in the mastery of a discipline. I have talked to various experts in different faculty in different subject areas, and it's often a very interesting conversation to ask them, well, where did you learn how to do research, the library part of the research in their discipline? And they often have to reflect back and think about that. And when they come up with answers, it's rarely a formal learning process. They learn it from their mentor, their instructors, if they're in the sciences, they often learn it in the lab. So I feel that information literacy does meet a lot of the characteristics of a threshold concept. So I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan.
Thank you, Kathy. One of the things that Kathy, Kevin, and I have been talking about is our realization that information literacy isn't just something that people practice just because. It's often practiced or grasped in another learning context or another critical or creative context. That is, people often exercise information literate skills or literacy skills because they're attempting to do something else. And we got a strong sense of how this works during the process of creating and implementing writing assessment on campus. And as we say here, the teaching of information literacy is embedded in other course context, particularly we've discovered in lower and upper division writing courses. So any attempt to understand information literacy probably needs to take into account those other contexts in which information literacy is practiced. And one of the ways in which I want to demonstrate that is through our writing assessment. And in fact, I think there's a way in which it's nice for Kathy to say that she was sort of following me and thinking about information literacy assessment on the heels of writing assessment. During the course of doing our writing assessment, we stumbled across all sorts of things, including information literacy issues. It's one of the things that makes assessment actually kind of interesting to do. So very quickly, I just wanted to take you through a little bit of the journey of our writing assessment over the last 5, nearly 6 years now. When I got here in 2007, I was very interested to know what students were doing in both lower and upper division writing courses. I came to campus with a certain set of predispositions in mind. The Council of Writing Program Administrators has produced over the last several years documents that set national standards for the teaching of writing, particularly the teaching of writing in first year or lower division courses. And I would invite you to actually go to this link. We don't have time to look at it in depth now, but the WPAcouncil.org frameworks document is a very good document that again attempts to set a national standard, or at least engender a national conversation about what we want collegiate writing instruction to do, literacy education to do, and also information literacy education to do as well. So I came to campus with an understanding from previous work and also from these national conversations about the interwovenness of writing instruction and information literacy as a concept, primarily through this notion of academic literacy. What does it mean to prepare students to be academically literate? And basically, the WPA identifies these key areas: rhetorical knowledge, critical thinking, writing processes, knowledge of conventions, and then also the ability to compose in multiple environments. And these were elements that I thought worked nicely with UCI's emphasis on, go back to the screen that Kathy showed you earlier, UCI's emphasis on inviting students to think about the multiple ways in which writing occurs, particularly across the disciplines, to think about knowledge dissemination within the disciplines, but then also increasingly to think about information literacy in particular and how different disciplines approach information literacy. So what we did back in the day, 2008, to begin generating information about how our students were or were not becoming effective writers, is we initiated a number of surveys, and we surveyed tons of people. We surveyed students in the lower division, students in the upper division, faculty in the lower division, faculty in the upper division, faculty who taught writing, faculty who do not regularly teach writing. And I just pull out some of the more important survey results that impact our conversation today. In winter 2008, we discovered that students reported making the largest gains in their research skills, followed by their ability to think, read, and write rhetorically, and their writing skills in general. And they perceived the composition courses, and this is in particular the 39C course, as very rigorous, and often felt overwhelmed by the research component of Writing 39C. For those of you who don't know, Writing 39C is the final comp course that satisfies the lower division writing requirement. And it's often characterized by a strong argument and research component. Students usually complete a roughly 10 to 12 page research-oriented project. So clearly, students felt that they were getting something out of that course, and they got the message that research was somehow a big part of that course, and they report gains in that area. Our winter survey in 2009 of both lower and upper division writing students, instructors, and non-writing faculty came up with this result for us. Both lower and upper division writing students reported great gains in rhetorical knowledge, critical thinking, reading, writing, and writing processes, and faculty perceive emphasizing these most. So what was interesting about this is that you notice sort of research begins to steadily drop out. So in this survey, we didn't really get a strong sense that students felt they were making gains. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that we were also querying upper division writing students. And so I began to be a little concerned that our upper division writing students might be sort of affecting the survey results that we were getting here, and weren't feeling necessarily that they were making particularly strong gains in their research orientation or their ability to conduct research or to report out on previously conducted research. So those are just perceptual surveys asking people what they felt they were learning in a variety of different courses. We also have done, for the past 5 years, a series of direct assessments in which we randomly pulled writing from a number of lower division and upper division courses, and have done a rubric-based assessment on vis-a-vis that writing. Some basic things that we've discovered, that the differences in writing skills are a function of students' lower division trajectory. The differences in writing skills as a function of students' lower division trajectory are fairly small. That is, whether students are in the Humanities Core course, or the first year integrated program, or the 39 sequence, we really can't tell huge differences in what students are producing when we compare one sequence to another. We're generally satisfied, in fact, with student progress in writing skills development by the end of the first year of writing instruction. Not perfect, but generally satisfied that by the time students are finishing one of those lower division writing programs, students have a fairly good grasp on some of the fundamentals of writing, can demonstrate a modicum of critical thinking, can get very rudimentary research and demonstrate that research in their work. Upper division writing assessment is a little bit more complicated, and I've been spending a lot of time recently thinking about the upper division writing assessment because it's difficult, as I say here, to develop a rubric that is flexible enough to use across the disciplines. When students reach upper division writing, they're generally moving into very discipline-specific genres of writing, and it's difficult to find a rubric that will allow us to capture a sense of student progress across all of those many different disciplines and genres in particular. The rubric that we have worked with has a fair amount of reliability, and generally when we work with the upper division writing products, we've discovered that most student papers that we are assessing seem of lower quality than we might expect. And that there are sometimes differences in quality between students who come to UCI directly from high school and those who transfer. These last two bullet points are particularly interesting. One would think that in an ideal world, students would finish lower division writing and then move into upper division writing, and that their skills in writing would get better and better and better. But what actually happens is that students finish lower division writing, and they're moving in a good direction, and then all of a sudden they get to upper division writing, and then boom, there seems to be a precipitous fall or drop off in writing ability. And it's taking me some time to figure out what might account for that. One basic answer that I can propose based on what I know about the history and the kind of research within composition studies broadly is that we do know that when students are introduced to whole new genres, whole new discourses of writing, there can be some regression in ability to demonstrate more basic writing skills that had previously been learned. Students cognitively will spend more time focused on the new skills, the new discourses, the new genres that they have to learn, and previously mastered skills might actually momentarily suffer. It's only within time that students are able to integrate the new skills with the previously learned skills, and then writing skills development continues to improve. If we had kind of uniform or even ubiquitous capstone experiences from which I could pull, I might actually be able to demonstrate that the writing trajectory looks like this. Students go through lower division, they steadily improve. They might hit a bump in upper division as they're trying to layer on new skills, new writing strategies and habits of mind. But then by the time they finish as seniors in a capstone experience of some kind, they probably are actually demonstrating significant gains over the course of 4 to 5 years. The differences in writing quality between UCI students who come from high school and those who transfer is something that we were able to demonstrate at times, but not necessarily uniformly, which I think is a function of differences amongst the different schools on campus. Some schools have more transfer students than others, for instance, humanities and social sciences, compared to engineering, for instance, or physical sciences. And also, differences are probably occurring depending upon where the students are actually coming from. We do know that some of our community college partners prepare students better in terms of writing, critical thinking, communication skills, as opposed to others. Moving a little bit more specifically into what kinds of issues students face in their writing. This is a chart which breaks down the lower division writing findings, both by year. We did several years of lower division writing and looked specifically at strengths of students in the humanities core course, first year integrated program, and the composition program. And you can see here, let's see, courses, what do I want to point you to? Strengths and weaknesses may be the two most relevant categories here. Year by year, dominant strengths, rhetorical knowledge, language, and style. It's interesting that for the most part, language and style seem to be very easily demonstrable strengths that we could identify in student writing, which is always interesting to me as campus writing coordinator, because I invariably get calls from across campus, senior faculty across the disciplines who will email or call irate that their students can't write. So, well, I actually have data that suggests they can. Dave, go ahead.
Could you just clarify, do you include rhetorical skill along with rhetorical knowledge?
How would you differentiate?
Well, the rhetorical knowledge suggests to me that they can identify some of the differences in types of arguments, but actually producing them is a different skill set.
That's a good question. Let's see if I can find our documents. Rhetorical knowledge. The rhetorical knowledge that we are working with, and I'm happy to pass out the rubrics that we actually used in scoring work, focuses on the ability of the student in a piece of writing to maintain a focus, to develop a thesis, to demonstrate expertise on a topic, and to be rhetorically aware of an audience, to have some sense that their writing is going to be read by someone else. So rhetorical knowledge in this case would not be, oh, I can identify a Rogerian argument versus another kind of Aristotelian appeal. Would have more to do with sort of the basic understanding of how a very rudimentary academic genre works. So, weaknesses: structure, organization, development, evidence, source research, development, evidence, sources, and research, development, evidence, sources, and research. You begin to see a pattern there. That a huge issue, a challenge that we often find students facing in lower division writing is the ability to integrate sources, to understand specifically how one might use somebody else's data or somebody else's research in relation to the original writer's work. And I often characterize this as that wonderful moment when you may be reading a student's paper and you're reading, and then boom, there just appears a quotation or some sort of data dump. And that's it. And the student writer picks up with his or her voice and then just continues on, and you were sort of left wondering, what do I do with that quotation? What do I do with that data? It doesn't seem connected. Am I, as the reader, supposed to intuit the connection? So in other words, it's at that moment of integration. Students, in nearly every case, use sources, but it's the connection of the source of the research material or of the data to the student's overarching project, which is often not as clearly articulated as we would like. In the upper division, again, I might point you to the strengths and the weaknesses. I can say that at this point, I don't have the most recent data for you because I just got the report last week, but we have at this point sample papers from all undergraduate degree granting schools on campus, and the results are interesting. They're somewhat, if you just eyeball it, they look like they're somewhat all over the map. I would point to how critical thinking is identified as a consistent weakness. The strength is interesting. The strength is truly all over the map. In the first year that we did our pilot assessments and looked at social ecology and the Writing 139 course, it seemed to be that use of evidence was the real was the real strength, and increasingly generic and disciplinary conventions, and then finally in the last 2 years, language and style conventions. The weakness is a little more consistency across what we're seeing in terms of weaknesses across the different disciplines, primarily critical thinking, nearly in every category, except for the last. And that would also be true of the last year of assessment that we did as well. Critical thinking itself in this 5th year identified as the primary weakness. And I actually think that critical thinking identified as a weakness here is related to the source integration problem. It's an extension of the source integration problem we saw in lower division. Primarily because we define critical thinking in this rubric as the ability to navigate multiple points of view. And so what we would be looking for in trying to identify effective critical thinking in a student work, a student piece of writing, would be to see how does the student manage differences in opinion, differences in interpretation of data, contradictory opinions and contradictory data. And I think that the challenge of critical thinking as we are defining it here is in some ways another way of thinking about the problem of source integration. I say that because we don't have a particular category in the upper division writing rubric called source integration, so that's not necessarily a visible category in the assessment. Instead, I'm theorizing that the trouble with critical thinking is related to a source integration problem. And in fact, one of the things that we've done in our conversations with faculty across the disciplines, but particularly with the librarians, is to try to help figure out how can we get an even more refined picture of what kinds of problems students are having when they go to conduct research, and try to integrate that research into their own work. So at this point, I will turn it back over to Kathleen.
So, one of the motivations for us to do this information literacy assessment in the library is we did want to measure and document the library's contribution to student learning. You can see that this is the most recent year for which I have a full year's worth of data, that we spend a lot of time and effort in this activity. We taught over 500 workshops. It reached over 14,000 students for almost 600 hours worth of contact. So this is a lot of resources that the library puts into this, and we really wanted a way to document how that might be contributing to student learning. So we had 2 questions, and we did decide to focus on first-year students because we have a very robust instruction program for those students within the library. We've worked really closely with the writing program for a long time. There's a really close relationship. And the other reason we decided to focus on the first year is that it's also a very consistent effort and a very consistent presence. Whereas once we get to upper division, all of our subject librarians have liaison responsibilities for each of the disciplines, each of the academic departments and schools, but the use of their abilities as instructors varies wildly, depending on what the discipline is, what the school is. And even within schools, there are some people who are very active in involving the librarians and other people who we never hear from. So we have this robust program, it's fairly consistent, and so we decided to focus on our first year students. So we actually had 2 questions that we wanted to answer. And Kevin was really, really helpful in helping us articulate all of this. So the first question was, we talk a lot about what students can't do. I don't think we often talk about what they can do, but we have all had conversations about they can't do this, they don't know how to use the library, they can't read critically. So my question was, well, what do they know? They must know something. They got to UC-Irvine, they have to know something. So we asked this question, what do first year incoming students know about library research and resources when they start at UC-Irvine, and what do they know by the end of their first year? That was our first question that we wanted to answer as part of this study. And the second question we had, and this was something that I think was really revelatory when we did this with the librarians, how do they use what they learn about library research in their first year writing assignments? Because I will admit this in this room, one of the advantages of being a librarian is that you get to do a lot of instruction, but you don't have to do a lot of grading. So we kind of get to do the fun part, and we don't have to do some of the other. But it also means that we don't have a lot of opportunity, except through our follow-up encounters at reference desk and those kinds of things, to systematically see what did students get out of what we tried to teach them. So we divided this into two phases. The first phase was to answer the first question, and we designed a research practices survey. Some of you actually may have remember recruiting your students to participate in this, and I thank you for doing that. This was a survey that we created on EEE. I believe it had 14 questions. Man, I have details about it. But basically, these were the things that we were trying to find out. The students who took it were recruited and self-selected, and we got over 700 students in the incoming class. We conducted this survey during the first 2 weeks of fall quarter, and it was only for our first year students. It wasn't for transfer students. We advertised it in a variety of ways. The writing instructors helped us recruit. We also put it on our webpage, and so we got participation in a variety of ways. So the first thing, we wanted to know different things. What were their attitudes and beliefs about research? How challenging did they think the research process was? How hard was it, or did they think it would be to identify and retrieve sources? And a little bit about their attitudes about the writing process. One of the things that Jonathan asked us to include, and this actually turned out to be a really good source of data, really interesting, we asked them to provide their own personal definition of research. So this was kind of a free text field. And then we had a section that was based on familiarity with research terms and strategies, use of sources, and we asked them to rank or tell us how important they thought research was for undergraduates. So if you want to see a copy of that survey, it's open on EEE. That's the URL. You can go ahead and take it. Nobody will be looking at it. But if you just want to get an idea of what kinds of questions we asked, we do have a copy of the survey available. So this is what we found based on the results of that survey. This was from the fall incoming. That 40% of them, and these are all self-reported, 40% of them have never used an electronic index to find information. I use Academic Search Complete up here, but there are other resources that are available in public libraries and high schools, so we identified those on the survey. So 40% of our students have no idea, have never used this kind of tool. 22% self-report having no experience locating the full text of articles. And I would hazard a guess that it's probably higher than that, but I still thought that that was fairly significant, that there were 22% who, 1/5 of our entering class have never located a full text of a journal article. The other really interesting piece of information that we got out of this was their knowledge of library research, their perceptions of how well they thought they would do versus their actual ability. They self-rated pretty highly on being able to do these things or finding them easy, but then when we looked at specific questions that would document whether or not they could, they performed much less highly than they thought they would. So we conducted the same survey. I have spring 2012, that's wrong. It's actually spring 2011. We gave the same survey the last 2 weeks of the spring quarter. Again, these students were recruited, so we can't guarantee that the same students who took the survey in the fall also took it in the spring. And for the exit survey, I think we got just about 400 students. So we actually found interesting things. overall, information literacy competence actually improved by the end of the first year, but confidence in the ability declined. So they kind of got to that good learning point of knowing what they didn't know. So they're in a place where they are starting to recognize that they don't know as much as they thought they did. Couple other things that were really interesting. The students who self-reported that they had completed the C course of a writing, so regardless of if it was Home Core, Writing 39C, or one of the FIPS, if they had completed that course, those students had the highest confidence and the highest competence of all the students surveyed. So I think, pat yourself on the back, writing instructors and librarians. We're actually accomplishing something. However, so that's the good news. The bad news is 50% of them still couldn't answer simple questions about the location, evaluation, and use of information correctly at the end of their first year. So they make progress, but they're definitely not information literate by the time they're done with that first year. Which is good, right?
Like what, for the last one? Like what, for example?
So an example of a question that we asked them, a very straightforward, we gave them an AntPack record, and we asked them if you wanted to find more information on the topic of this book, how would you do it? The correct answer being, use the subject headings. So that was one example of, and there were a couple others. I don't have the survey.
No, that's fine.
Yeah.
Kathy, it might be interesting to say that I don't think we would expect students to be fully information literate at the end of the first year.
This is job security.
Yeah, based on, well, but also based on your previous definition about having a kind of a broadly disciplinary
Right.
Understanding of what information literacy is. It would not even be possible for a student to be information literate based on that definition by the end of the first year.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't think that this is something that, we should be beating ourselves up about, but I do think it is something that I would like to share more broadly with faculty who do teach in the disciplines, because I think they have a lot of assumptions about what students can and can't do and what they do and don't know. So the second part of our assessment was this information literacy trait assessment. And this was really, really interesting and fascinating. And I think really, like I said, eye-opening for the librarians. Basically, we based, and you guys have a copy of it, so one of the things that you have is sheets of paper that I gave you is an information literacy rubric. This is the rubric that we created. It was based on the writing assessment rubric, but we organized it by information literacy competency standards. There are 5 of them. So each attribute, each standard has several attributes. Because one of the things that I found was really interesting about designing this rubric was to go from the standards, which we had consciously decided to use because we thought it would make our results more comparable to results from other institutions, was to say, okay, if information literacy, the first standard is the information literate student determines the nature and extent of the information needed. Well, how do you recognize that in student writing? So what would be the evidence that you could look at that would tell you that a student knew that? We'll talk a little bit about what we finally ended up doing in a second. So we had 73 student papers, 8 librarians. This rubric actually has 18 traits because we split out a couple, or at least one, measuring 18 traits using a 4-point scale. And overall, the overall results were that the average score students got 48.1 out of 68. So 68 would have been the high score, and overall the average was 48.1. So you can see by looking at the rubric what we were measuring, and that this is how it came out. So we have kind of what the average was, what the average score was. And it's very interesting to note that the highest scoring category was number of sources. So if you tell your students to use 6 sources, they will use 6 sources faithfully. However, the lowest
That's not the
scoring, that's the problem. The lowest scoring categories were, as Jonathan said, source integration, use of quotations, and by that we didn't mean quote marks, but how they actually integrated those quotes into their writing. The range of sources, so the different kinds of sources that they used, they had a lot of trouble with incorporating multiple points of view into their paper. They were really good at presenting one. If they were getting better, they could kind of do 2, but after that, it really fell off. And then the other thing, this wasn't actually even something that we were really looking at, but as librarians, we all just couldn't stand not talking about it. They, to a person, did not provide enough bibliographic information in their citations that you could identify and locate the materials cited. So that was another thing that we really felt needed some work, because that's a fairly mechanical skill that's easy to teach, but you know, they for whatever reason weren't getting it. So at this point, I thought, Jonathan and I thought it would be fun to do some actual assessment. So the first thing you have is a sheet of paper that says TLTC Colloquy, kind of worksheet, evaluation of student writing. It has 2 standards on it, Standard 1 and Standard 3. And on the back, there's a student annotated bibliography. So what I'd like you to do, and you can talk to each other or do it individually, this will probably take about 5 minutes, I would say, maybe not even, is read the bibliography and then look at Standard 1 and Standard 3 and determine how well the student met those objectives.
And part of the reason that I decided to do that originally with the lower and upper division writing assessment is because I was curious about how the overall programs and courses were helping students meet separate student learning outcomes for entire programs. So you're absolutely right, as a pedagogue, this might be perfectly acceptable as the function of an assignment. But I think part of what Kathy and I and Kevin were trying to get at in doing our separate assessments is that we also recognize whole programs have to meet certain outcomes. And the only way to try to get at those outcomes is to momentarily suspend the relationship of writing product to assignment and then see, well, what is the relationship of that product to an overarching program set of outcomes. So there are going to be these sorts of gaps. There's no doubt about it.
And actually, you know, what you're talking about came up a lot in our discussion with the librarians because we did a lot of norming before we actually did the final one. But what's the assignment? What's the student expected to be able to do? And, you know, we kept saying, we want you to see if you can recognize these traits. I mean, that was part of what I wanted to know was, could you recognize information literacy traits not knowing what the assignment was? That was part of what I was trying to figure out from this. So Dee and then Kathy.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, because it seems like that's an inherent assumption in the writing program administrators' definitions as well, that there should be some common traits even across disciplines, that people can agree that, you know, this meets certain criteria for academic writing.
Yeah, but coming to
More
that
common
agreement
than question.
is sometimes, you know, theoretically.
Well, but when you know, we all know that when we've taught writing or we've been doing workshops on training people to teach writing, you know, you go back to that initial statement that you started with regard to threshold concepts. And that is that, well, kind of, I know it when I see it, because it is so integrated but not articulated.
Yeah.
Well, with Standard 2, when you're talking about the ability to evaluate the sources, first of all, there needs to be some type of ability to comprehend the sources. back to whether they weren't using sources as part of their literacy. It goes back to whether or not they understood the sources in the first place. But a lot of students have a tendency, especially the classes where they teach them to latch on to the little details, but they're completely missing the big point of the source.
Exactly.
Kathy identifies the greatest assumption of them all in I think both lower and upper division writing instruction is the assumption of reading ability. And over the last several years, I have increasingly told upper division writing faculty that they should not assume that students are able to read the kinds of genres that upper division writing faculty are requesting that they write, and that asking a student to write any particular discipline-based genre is going to be hampered from the beginning if students don't have a facility in reading in that genre. And that they have to really know how to read a lab report, for instance, in order to be able to understand how to then generate one of their own.
And
So-
at that lower division level too, I mean, there's so little exposure, and this is tough reading.
Yes.
This is not what they're
Yeah.
used to.
So we talk about reading and writing as integrated skills and strategies.
So the next part.
And in fact, what we might want to do very quickly, because we
yeah.
want to make sure that you have enough time to offer up some feedback. In fact, you've already been really helpful in helping me, I'm sure Kathy too, and Kevin think through some of the things that we've been working on. I want to give you a short essay and look at how the library used its information literacy rubric to evaluate it. Does everybody have a copy?
Yes, I
Okay,
think
great.
so. Everyone should have, or if you don't,
The Food Safety Enhancement Act of 2009. Those two skills are ones that the lower division really needs to help students at least get a grip on, because although recognizing that they will be differently deployed in the upper division. In fact, one of the consistent complaints that I get from my colleagues but especially in the hard sciences, is that students coming to them from the lower division have a penchant for quoting, which is not generally encouraged in hard scientific writing.
Or for introducing sources and their credibility all the time, and in the scientific articles it's discouraged.
So those are interesting disciplinary differences about the handling, about the handling of sources and how those sources are integrated into student writing. So, other thoughts, comments, questions?
So one of the
Please.
things, so I don't teach undergraduate writing, I teach language, but I also do a lot of editing of graduate student writing. And one of the skills they have difficulty with is they make a statement, and I want to know where they got that. Right, so they're writing a nice narrative about, a problem and what other people have done about it, but I keep having to write in ref, here's a bold statement, how do you know this?
Right.
So, it's related to this thing about, where are your sources and how are you integrating what you're reading.
Right.
But they don't read their own stuff saying, I'm making a bold statement, I better back it up. So it means writing something and then go finding the evidence for it, as opposed to doing all the bibliographic stuff first and then writing.
Interesting, yeah.
So
It's a good question. What does one need to actually reference,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
what kinds of things? And this is sort of a pedagogical problem of producing writing within a course context, because you might be saying something again and again and again that will then appear in student writing, because by that point,
well known.
Professor Olson says it, so it must be well known.
Olson,
Boom, yeah,
2013.
right.
Personal
Precisely.
communication.
I mean, anybody who's been teaching often finds their own language. In fact, in a staff meeting yesterday, with Libby, I pointed to some writing of one of her students and said, "Oh, this sounds like Libby," and Libby said, "Well, no, it actually sounds like one of the things that we were reading." Oh, there you go. So the students, will adopt that language sometimes, or even that content, and not recognize, just because the writing is produced within a particular course context. So then it becomes incumbent upon us to remind them about the necessity of citing material that is not necessarily common knowledge. I think that's a rhetorical problem. You understand what I'm saying when I call it a rhetorical problem? That the rhetorical situation of the classroom might itself license a little bit of fudging there, because well, the student knows you're really the primary reader, and if you've said it or if it's just part of the course content, then why? Of course you're going to know this. Why do I need to cite it? So without actually providing robust extracurricular rhetorical circumstances or situations for our students, it's hard to teach that. A lot of people in composition will say, and Keith, you, Kathy, Emily, you know exactly what I'm talking about. We tell students all the time, imagine an audience. And the students are like, oh yeah, sure, okay, right. Let's make believe. And so this is part of the difficulty of teaching writing in curricular contexts that are not rhetorically robust. So,
But
please.
I remembered a student in 39 C that had made some bold statement, and I insisted that the student back it up, and said, but I didn't find a source that said exactly that. I'm saying that. I said, yeah, but it's still a bold statement, so you have to give me something that gives
Why do you think
reason,
that?
support. The idea of having support, because some of the students were looking for something that was exactly that. This whole idea that you build it by pieces of support to line up why you made that statement it's a process, a rhetorical process.
Other thoughts or questions, comments about this particular paper? We don't have to do this in small groups, but we did want to ask a question about the implications of our results for how you introduce students to the major within your disciplines, how you might teach, if you don't teach upper division writing, still how you might use writing within your courses, or teach research within your courses, or since we have several people from the lower division writing programs here, I'd love to know about their thoughts in relation to the research that we have done about information literacy.
Well, one thing I do offer them is, in the context of practice description, is okay, so instead of just picking a topic, if you're doing mentored research or something like that, work with that and come up with community assignment guidelines with that for the researching. And now they're already involved in something they're interested in, they're working at it, now they can actually take that and try to construct a writing assignment, a paper from them.
I'd love to have ideas on how to share this more broadly with disciplinary faculty, because I think, we probably, a lot of us here have some sense of what students can and can't do, but I don't know that other people have had that luxury when they get those students. So I don't know how to push this out more broad, or make this people more aware of. I know Jonathan's done a really good job of sharing the writing findings.
With Abraham's help, we're sort of in the process of trying to get some information about the writing findings out there, and one of the things that I know that I'm going to do more in my workshops with upper division writing faculty, we'll probably even do a video specifically on this, is how to craft an assignment prompt in which, if you're going to invite students or require that students use outside sources or consult data, that you not just set a numerical value of how many sources need to be included, but that you actually provide active instruction on what students are supposed to do with that research and why they have to do something with that research. I just think we don't talk to students enough about why literate citizens would engage in research, would actually look for what somebody else thinks and think about their thoughts in relation to pre-existing discipline-based conversations. So I think we can do a lot in just crafting assignments to help students understand why we're asking them to look for research or to generate data, and then how to incorporate that and integrate that more effectively into their own work. It's interesting, Judy said that she doesn't teach writing, but I bet you give writing assignments, which is a form of teaching writing.
I know, I teach project management, and
Yep.
there are a lot of very standard documents that they have to fill out. and I often then will show them a couple of good ones.
Yeah, that's teaching writing, absolutely. Modeling.
That's UC writing.
Yeah, modeling effective writing, and then just spending in a few minutes talking about why this is an effective piece of writing. May be one of the most powerful ways in which you actually can teach writing. So.
I mean, I would say that this idea of like what does the student already know, what is it that we can expect them to actually master over the course of the year, that kind of knowledge, even among lower division writing staff, because that's where I am, even if that were more widely disseminated, it would do a useful service of cutting through the emotional response of some writing instructors who are very good writers, who have a kind of oh my god reaction that is actually not that helpful. You know, I mean, I have that too, you know, but there's a sort of
Oh my god, reaction to what? What are they?
Well, there's a sort of how is
Shock.
it? Yeah, a shock that can dovetail into a cynicism. The shock is fine. It's when it dovetails into cynicism that it's a problem, you know?
And then shock is students' inability?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think it comes from our assumptions that they know more than they do, particularly with the
Right.
digital aspects. A lot of times we just assume that, students are with their computers all day long, that, of course they know the databases and they know all that type of stuff on research, and they don't.
Oh, and they think that too. I mean, one of the interesting things about the survey that Kevin and Kathy and I did was that students, as Kathy pointed out, rate very highly their abilities before they get here, or right when they're first getting here.
So that kind of flows over on us, and we assume it too because of their confidence.
Yeah.
Is it because they're Googling everything?
Exactly.
They know how to get on Google. I think they're good.
Well, yeah. As Kathy said, we had the open-ended question, which was about how do you define research, and that is very revealing because people would often say, "Oh, I get lucky on Google," and it's But also there are just limitations. I mean, we cannot expect that high school instructors, for instance, will teach effective research, in part because they just don't have access to the sorts of library resources that we do on a college campus. So it's not at all surprising that students don't really have any experience in using databases. But why would they?
I just want to follow up one thing that I thought was really interesting about their definition of research. They kind of grouped into various categories, but one significant definition was, well, it's finding out evidence to support what you already know. So it's that idea, I mean, a lot of them, I would say maybe up to a third of the students in various ways said, research is finding, support for, so just introducing students to the idea, again, a threshold concept of no, research is finding out what you don't know and bringing it together in a new way they're not there yet. And so I think that actually was very revealing in terms of a response. And it helps to understand how they evaluate and choose to incorporate information into their writing, because they're going to tend to want to use things that reinforce the argument that they already have decided is the correct one or the right one.
And that parallels a lot of my own experience, and I'm sure my colleagues in the back will recognize this narrative. I've had many students come to me during my office hours to say, I can't write anything until I have a thesis. So I'm like, oh my god.
Just start
Because I can't write anything if I have a thesis.
Apparently they
I
can
use
write
writing
something
finally.
without having
Well, apparently, yeah. Part of the challenge that we have is teaching them how to think about writing as a modality in search of thought, not just a modality of expressing pre-existing thought.
Right.
Same thing with research. Research is looking for what you think, as opposed to just confirming what you think. I'd love to get some of that data actually into our PowerPoint slides, because I think writing folks would really resonate with that.
Although I think that is a very important point, though, about that it is also confirming what you think. You know, this is how I think, and this is like, oh, well, that doesn't really hold. Yeah, so I think that is a very important component of research.
I think so.
This is, again, more of a pronouncement than anything else, but, we do the new Faculty Teaching Academy every year, and it is voluntary. And this is such a wonderful forum where a lot of this information could be provided to new faculty, and I think it would save them a lot of frustration and potential cynicism to know some of these things. And maybe again, it's another opportunity for us to work together. But I think it's also a marketing issue to get the faculty there.
This is actually really good feedback, and Keith's comment I'm going to take very seriously, and it might be interesting to actually do a version of this just for the comp and the HumCore faculty. We're going to have an all-hands comp HumCore faculty meeting to talk about these issues, because you see them first. You see these students first. And that's kind of the front line for introducing them to these concepts. So having a stronger sense, based on this research, about what they're coming to you with and without might be really useful.
Well, that thing about the science instructors complaining later, it's like, I'm right there. I'm telling them to quote like crazy. So I'm like, no, guilty. That's me. I'm the one who's sending them your way like that. So that's an interesting thing to think
It's
about.
just a difference in genre.
Yeah,
I know, but it's
precisely,
interesting to sort of think about that. That's because most of my science students are science students too. So.
Well, it's important, and the funny thing is that this is the sort of thing that we're discovering as a product of this assessment. As we go from school to school and discipline to discipline, and invite people to come in and sit down with us and talk to us about what they value in writing. Then we learn more about how to, in the lower division, you can't teach students all of the genres in which they're going to have to write later, but you can teach them a kind of genre flexibility, a recognition that, when they're sitting in a class with Jeff, versus sitting in a class with Judy, there very well might be different expectations for what the writing is going to look like, and how it's going to, how they will put it together, and how they will format it, and that I think you can teach that flexibility.
Yeah, they need to be exposed to both.
Yeah.
But I also wonder how many of us really have a good understanding of what the other
I think that's a really
require.
good point. And one of the things that happened with the librarians, we had librarians with humanities background, social science, and sciences. And when we first started doing our norming for this evaluation, they were very different from each other. The social science and humanists probably closer. The science, the librarians with the science background evaluated these papers very differently, read them very differently than the other two. The social sciences and humanities were, I think, a little bit more closely aligned with each other. So that was actually that was interesting information for me to realize that here we are all working in the same profession, and we can't interpret this same information in a uniform way. So
Different discourse communities.
yes,
Are going to understand writing differently. The single craziest encounter I've had so far during this writing assessment was with a physicist, and I say that in part because physics still scares me. But I guess not physics itself, the study. But we were looking at honors physics research papers, senior level research papers, and they were all about 20, 25 pages each. And invited the physicists to come, talk to us about writing processes, writing values. What do physicists value in terms of reporting out information about experiments? And he said, when I first pick up one of these papers, if this is a research report in physics, I look at the title, I look at the abstract, I read the abstract. Then I look at the 4 to 5 diagrams and the captions. If I don't understand the paper based on title, abstract, the 4 to 5 diagrams, and the captions, no good. So that is a completely different way of reading than I am used to, that I was ever trained in. But he's making a point, I think a very good point, about how, curiously enough, the images themselves, the diagrams, the visual field of the paper was significant enough and had to carry the weight of the argument of the paper in a way that, in my training, it doesn't, not even remotely resonant. And so those different discipline-based conventions about how to generate work, disseminate it, read it, really important. And this actually clued me in to thinking about how, in the lower division, we could teach the visual field better. We often sometimes will talk to students about just, sometimes an image, can be really important. When you move into the hard sciences, and Jeff could tell us a lot about this in engineering, engineers and hard scientists have extraordinarily detailed guidelines and conventions about how to and when to incorporate visual elements into their written products. And their writings will live or die by the quality of those images, those diagrams, how they're captioned, and the relevance that they have to the paper as a whole. So that's a very particular way of understanding the visual field in writing, especially since many of those diagrams are not necessarily ones that are produced by students, but are actually reproduced from other sources. And in fact, as Kathy knows, and who else worked on anybody else here work on the you very well know this, on the academic integrity tutorial, we actually include a slide in the academic tutorial, on the academic integrity tutorial, about properly crediting the use of images, the use of images in papers, because many of our students don't have a very sophisticated sense of how to use images or diagrams or pictures, and how to understand them as information that needs to be properly cited or discussed. So anything else?
One general overall comment. We were talking about the track, they go and they start as freshmen, enter, and they build up their skills, and maybe there's a slight bump, and then at the end they go up, ramp up again and get that capstone. Well, I'm finding that, especially the class I'm speaking from my point of view in the School of Engineering, they are right there with one foot out the door to graduation taking upper division writing.
Yeah, and that's a problem.
Yeah, could you please take it in your junior year so that you can now...
That's what we advise.
Yeah, and anyway, that's just a...
I hear you.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I hear you. We know that those courses generally do work better when they are taken late sophomore or early junior year, because they really are introductory courses, almost ubiquitously. I mean, I guess I shouldn't say it that way. 90% of them are really introduction to writing in the disciplines courses. There are some residual upper division writing courses that are still a little capstone-y, but most disciplines have re-visioned them as introduction to writing in the disciplines. In which case, it would only make sense that initial student effort in those courses is just not going to be superior. It will be at an introductory level.
And some of that being done in parallel with the senior design project.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, in your case, students would take your tech writing course in the junior year, and then continuing to write throughout their careers. By the time they get to the senior capstone engineering project, they should be doing really well. Yes. And in fact, engineering is a really interesting example because many of those capstone projects are extraordinary.
Yes.
And so, your school is a case in which one could track from lower division, the students are learning to write as engineers, but then by the time they finish the capstone projects, probably have done extremely well, have actually made significant ground, or gained significant ground in learning how to write within the discipline as engineers. So, but yes, timing is important. Yes. There are resources available on campus that can help you. I'll point you to the Writing Center website, which has lots of resources, ever-expanding body of resources as we populate the site about how to think about research, how to teach research, teach source integration. The libraries can do stuff too. Kathy?
Yeah, so contact us. We already have a fairly robust presence in the lower division writing. I think Jeff has probably worked with Julia Gelfand in engineering. But there are other resources as well, and just referring back to our online tutorials might be something that you could remember that you have available as a resource. We will create library guides for specific courses or different disciplines. And I think various ways to integrate information literacy instruction into the course content, even if students aren't required to write a paper, obviously would vary by discipline, but that's another area of expertise that we can provide, so.
I just want to comment that I really like those course guides because
Good.
they're now course-specific resources. I really like it. I think that's a fabulous thing, so I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you, good.
I'd also recommend that more push be given to transfer students who come in directly to the upper division writing. I teach an upper division writing class, almost all transfer, so I bring you guys to me, but I'm sure there are lots of transfers, because all the transfer students I've taught are clueless about databases and so on.
Okay.
Yeah, community colleges often are not in a position financially to afford databases.
And we do have, Brian Williams is our transfer center liaison. So, if there are ways that we can work with the transfer center to make some kind of library workshop more widely available or required, we'd be happy to work with them on that, because we know that transfer students don't have this 2-year integration or orientation period. They jump right in, they're expected to know how to do a lot of these things, and they've never even been introduced to our library website, so they're really at a disadvantage, I feel, in that sense, so.
Thank you very
Well,
much.
thank you all for coming.